We started on day one, on Saturday, with a reflection on the question of how to write history. And one of the key factors in this reflection or discussion of historiography was the idea that historiography is not only about things in the past, but it rather means a method that pays attention, that acknowledges questions of contingencies, specific historical constellations, and that makes us to ask about sort of the specific way how things came about. We also realized already in the first session that one element that comes into play here is the necessity to work on various levels. On the one hand, to be very specific, to be able to read the fragmented document that we only have of performances and to open them up to more complex discussions. This is something we have carried out as a permanent exercise in the past days in trying to read set designs, in trying to read photographs, and trying to understand what they convey to us. I think one of the biggest traps for us, or the two biggest traps I think in the humanities is, on the one hand, the desire to recognize ourselves in the sources, to find something that speaks immediately to us, that speaks to our sentiment. Very often this happens sort of through the lens of psychological realism, so we tend to identify with the characters. And secondly, to move our analysis to the level of the plot line. But I think what is so important, especially when we talk about theater and performances, not only to pay attention to the question what is told, but also how it is told. And how sometimes the specific kind of an aesthetic language transpires a meaning that even might thwart what is said explicitly on the plot line. So a formalist language is one of the layers that really is important in being able to work with the material specificities of the documents that we have of the performances. But secondly, I think it's equally important to acknowledge that theater and performance history, I suggest to consider this as larger part of media history, also requires the ability of opening it up to larger discourses, to situate it in a larger social and cultural context, something I had introduced to frame with the concept of Sitz im Leben. So where is the specific situatedness of a performance, of a presentation, and how does it play out? So this was what we did on day one. On day two, we moved on to something we had dubbed Dreams of India, and I had introduced to you various forms of representation of India on the Western stage, specifically on the German stage, and we had taken a closer look at the performances of Hagemann. I also brought you, and I don't want to threaten you, I know that's bad pedagogy, but if you don't ask questions, we go back to these sources. I'm kidding. We have more of the images we can discuss, and I think it would be worth to go back to them as well. Finally, someone on the internet broke down and asked a question. Yes?
There are about 3 questions online. Should I go one by one?
Yeah.
The first is, please elaborate more about the impression of Lotte Reniger's work on the German shadow theater and actors theater and progression of their cultural history.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I dodged that question a couple of days ago, and I'm more than happy to pick it up. So there is a German artist who, at the end of the 1910s and the 1920s, starts to produce the first trick movies in European history. She's among the first ones to do that. And she does this in a very clear black and white silhouette logic. So these films have often been compared to the European tradition of shadow play. And it's sort of, it works like a stop motion movie, technically. But what is particularly interesting is that Lotte Reiniger sort of, for the most famous parts, she has chosen motifs from, for example, the Arabian Nights. So very often she works in quote-unquote exotic / quote-unquote oriental settings. And I think this is kind of in line with an observation we made earlier about shadow theater as a genre as such. I told you that shadow theater sort of first appears as the ombre italien, the Italian shadows, and gets dubbed as Chinese shadows in the 18th century. So Lotte Reiniger's reference, permanent reference to quote-unquote oriental topics, the most famous film is called Prince Ahmed, sort of is in line with a conflation of the form of shadow play on the one hand and the specific subject line on the other hand. It is also worth to note that the tradition of shadow play undergoes a certain transformation or receives a revival in the 1880s. And this happens in Paris in the legendary Café Chantant the Chat Noir, which is a small stage where a specific type of cabaret is invented during the 1880s and sort of gets really a global notion during the World Fair in Paris 1888 when the Eiffel Tower is opened. And Charles Rivière develops a model that by film historians is often described as a sort of really a kind of pre-cinematographic form of performance, because here really the shadow plays rely less on the narrative that very often came with a shadow play, but sort of it's a very wide screen and the images sort of merge into each other. And this is also a sensation. If you look at the reviews, the descriptions of these performances, they sort of often are described in a vocabulary that resonates with our experience of film. So I think Lotte Reiniger kind of is at the crossroads between the tradition of shadow play and the beginning of film, and she merges this into one. I think she was particularly successful, although I have to say her success kind of ended abruptly at the end of the 1920s, because the fascination for this kind of trick movie ended more or less rapidly. That the popularity of her work in the 1920s coincides with the aesthetic fascination in the medium of film for light and shadow. I had already hinted at the work of Lotte Eisner, The Haunted Screen, that sort of deals a lot with the question of the usage of shadow in theatrical productions, particularly by Max Reinhardt, but also to what extent these legendary Weimar Republic films by Fritz Lang, by Wilhelm Murnau, sort of were typical in their usage of creating a semi-dream-like visual language where shadows and lights played a particular importance. I hope I've answered that question comprehensively.
Question is, I am back at the case study of Shakuntala, especially when Fritz is working here in parallels and also takes up some Indian productions in Germany. Please, there's some other points also. Vijay Mehta did the production of Shakuntala with German actors. I saw some pictures which uses temple aesthetics to do it. So in the 70s, the idea of purity, beauty, nature, is it still carrying on?
I'm not familiar with the Benevit's productions of Shakuntala. I think this goes to Vishnupriya. So maybe we can return to that tomorrow in the open round session when she might join us. So I simply have to delay this.
The next question is, could you please discuss a bit about the tension, if any, between the West Germany Goethe Institute and Fritz Benevit's GDR interventions in India? Fritz mentions in one of his accounts that the West Germany was trying to copy him. Could you please throw some light on it?
Again, I think we should ask Vishnupriya about that. I think this is much more her terrain. What I can say, but I would also ask Amit sort of to chime in, because he has extensively worked on Heime's work, is that the Goethe Institute, as it was customary in the Cold War for many, many nations, sort of to build these cultural institutions as a kind of, let's say, diplomatic sideline. And the Goethe Institute was comparatively reluctant. I think Heime was the first one to be brought to India. So they were comparatively reluctant to sponsor entire theater productions. And to my understanding, this is what I know from the files, it really exhausted their budget to an extent they had not assumed before. So I think the mission of, or the constant presence of Fritz Benowitz sort of seems to be a long-term commitment that GDR made in sort of financing this, whereas the Goethe Institute for sure tried to create some visibility, some presence for West German theater. But I think, at least in this field, by far didn't have the means that the GDR might have had. And I also think, in line with that, it's symptomatic, something I mentioned in passing, the two German states were kind of in a permanent competition against each other from the get-go. And there were sort of two decisive key lines. The one was, which state sort of has really cleansed itself from the Nazi past? And here it was very evident that the GDR sort of meant a completely fresh start when it came to the personnel and the political leadership of the state. Whereas the 1950s up to the 1960s were, in West Germany, were repeatedly marked by scandals of revelation about the Nazi past of certain actors. And there were some people who even had to step down from office because suddenly it was revealed that they were not as innocent and saints as they had pretended to be. But the second factor in this competition was the question, sort of, who owns the good past of German history? And especially the Weimar years, the years of the First Republic, sort of were of decisive importance. And there was an eagerness sort of to get prominent emigres back to the part in Germany to the several parts of Germany. So when Brecht decided to go back to East Berlin, allow me a snarky remark in brackets, Brecht did not go to East Berlin before he had secured to have an Austrian passport. So Brecht never became a citizen of the GDR. He always had a backdoor to leave the country whenever he wanted to, because Helene Weigel also, she was an Austrian citizen. So this is kind of the ambivalence of Brecht returning. So Brecht returns, and with him, the most prominent theater protagonist of the Weimar Republic goes to East Berlin. And there's a huge debate in the West whether to perform Brecht at all, which is very reluctantly done, but then since the 1960s, he really is a permanent on the German repertoire. And this is why the production of Piscator and also the position of Heime is so interesting. So the Goethe Institute's choice to send Heime, I think, as Amit has yesterday pointed out already, meant to make a claim of saying, we also know political theater. And through the figure of Heime, who had been Piscator's assistant, sort of there was a line that could make a legitimate claim to the political tradition of political theater in the Weimar Republic. Although, and also something, Amit, but you very gently sort of just mentioned it in bypassing, for whatever city Heime worked in, he really became a pain in the neck. He once told me he never finished a contract in good terms, but was more or less thrown out of most of the cities. So as much as he was a very controversial figure, I think the Goethe Institute's strategic assumption was that this was someone who would be eye to eye with Benowitz when it came to the question of political consciousness in the art. Amit, you want to add to something?
No, I think this is quite fine. And also kind of Jaime's and also engagements. We should also understand there are also a lot of kind of trafficking between the Germanies, which Jaime is also very central for, because he will do one is, of course, he'll do Brecht, and like I said yesterday, that some of its Brecht became controversial to kind of the level that he is not allowed to do Brecht at all after that by the Brecht Foundation, so he drops that. But he also will do a lot of playwrights from the GDR. Especially people who have gone on exile from GDR. So he's also picking up texts which are controversial, and he's controversial in West Germany. So he's sort of, I guess, picking up political kind of things which are controversial from both sides, I suppose. So he's also somebody who's commissioning a lot of work from and kind of working with a lot of text that is coming out from GDR in a very kind of turbulent time. So I guess I thought that would be important.
Yeah, so thank you very much. I think that's a very important point, and just to sort of add up to that, it's interesting. Later in the day, hopefully, we will speak about Heiner Müller, for example, and it's interesting that many of these nowadays iconic playwrights of the GDR were first performed in the western part of Germany. So since the 1960s, there's a constant exchange of people who work in both German states, some even sort of who cross the line, like Peter Palic, for example. Peter Weiss is going back and forth, but Peter Palic, who was one of the assistants of Brecht, sort of leaves the GDR in '61. So interestingly, the international fame of the GDR plays and dramas of the 70s and 80s is partly channeled through the West Germany. Sorry, I think now we completely flooded the poor person who asked the question. I apologize, with many informations he never wanted to have. He or she never wanted to have. Is there more?
There's one more question. The symbiotic relationship that theatre historiography needs to cultivate between the performances and the public or audience, where both inform the study of the other. Given how trauma studies around historical events like colonialism or Nazism have a temporal and spatial distance of collective experience and its aftermath, how does theatre and performance studies formulate new frames of inquiries of intent, staging and material of theatre productions to revisit these collective histories in theatre?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. This is a very important question. I sort of first tried to answer that from a German perspective, and then, Amit, I tried to drag you or Indu into this difficulty. So just take a moment, and because I think this is very different from the cultural context. So in Germany, and here I'm specifically speaking about West Germany. I can also make some remarks about the GDR, but let's focus on West Germany for a start. In West Germany, after 1949, after the foundation of the Bundesrepublik, the Nazi period is something like an anathema that is barely spoken about. And there sort of is people quipping that if you ask people on the street, no one was part of member of the party. No one sort of contributed. So the Nazis seem to be like an alien population that left after 45. And the psychologist Alexander Mitscherlich sort of coined this important phrase in 1968, which sort of became one of the decisive formula in dealing with this question. He wrote a book that is called Die Unfähigkeit zu trauern, the incapacity to mourn. And he described this as a collective psychological moment where the population lived to such an extent in denial that they were unable to address the question of the immediate past explicitly. This changed over the course of time through two important events. And the first one is the so-called Frankfurter Auschwitz process, the trial about Auschwitz, which I think is in 1961, when a very courageous district attorney, Fritz Bauer, Jewish himself, Jewish and gay, dared to put people on trial who were only allegedly, quote-unquote, bystanders of the Shoah. So he put the guards of the concentration camps on trial. He put the people who drove the trains to the concentration camps on trial. And this was, through doing this, he forced the German public to realize how broad the how do you call that? If you are accomplice? Complicity, how far the complicity of the German society was, even in circles where people pretended to be innocent. And to magnify this process, the playwright Peter Weiss created a drama called Die Ermittlung, the investigation. And Peter Weiss did nothing but taking the files from court and arranging them in a theatrical way. And this is the only example I know of that a play premiered not only in several cities at the same time, but also in East and West at the same time. So however Weiss managed to arrange for that, was very evident that there was a political awareness that the German society has to start to face the reality. There's an event that also falls in line with that, and that is the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem. Eichmann was the civil servant who engineered the Shoah to a large extent. He had fled to Latin America. He was caught by the Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service. He was brought to Jerusalem and put on trial. And there's a very famous document by the German/American philosopher Hannah Arendt, where she coins this term, and I think I'm still at the question of theater. I get back to that. Don't worry. I haven't lost my train of thought. And Hannah Arendt coins this term, the triviality of the evil, because Eichmann was not the devil. He was not a monster, but he was a petty, small man who just pretended to be a very good bureaucrat. And sort of, highlighting the fact to what extent bureaucracy was not just a neutral apparatus, but sort of was complicit with the Shoah, contributed to it, and contributed to mass murder. This really was a process of revelation. But the second most important event that changed, and here we come back to the question of media representation, that changed the attitude towards the Shoah almost simultaneously in the United States, in Israel, and in Germany, was the broadcasting of the TV series Holocaust. This happened in 1979. So it was a 6-part miniseries. And this actually, for Jewish families of victims, as well as of German families of perpetrators, this was the moment when families started to talk about. There are numerous testimonies of people saying, when this was broadcasted, also with the temporal distance of 34 years after the end of World War II, this was when families started to realize, I don't know what my father has done. I don't know what my mother has gone through. And it's so interesting because it really, in a very awkward way, connects the United States, Israel, and Germany in the reception, in the growing awareness of that. So to get back to the question of how theater and media in the broader sense is able to address traumatic experiences, how it relates to history and to the wounds of history, I think I would give a twofold answer. we have the model of Peter Weiss on the one hand, magnifying the voices that otherwise might not be heard, taking the court files on the stage and reading them aloud, sort of to give people a voice who otherwise would be victimized and marginalized. The example of the Holocaust TV series is a little bit more complicated because dramaturgically it is a comparatively conventional series. But it also tells about the necessity to create narratives that sort of allow people to remember and memorialize events that otherwise might be too shameful or painful to talk about. And I think this is, at least this would be, and I can only say this for the German perspective, this would be one of the key functions of theater and performance, sort of in providing these spaces. And if I may give a small footnote before I hand over, the German theatrical discourse up until, I would say, the late 1990s was governed by a very strong aesthetic assumption, and that is that you cannot talk about the Holocaust in terms of psychological realism. This has to do, on the one hand, with a philosophy that developed after 1945. One of the most prominent representatives of that would be the Italian philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, who sort of said the only true witnesses of the Holocaust are the victims, those who were killed. Even the survivors have not really gone through the entire experience. So there was an awareness from the perspective of the victims that this is something we cannot talk about. But there was also an awareness that psychologically it would be some kind of a perversion to psychologically, realistically present the perpetrators. So there was a big reluctance on the German stage to represent Hitler, for example, and other major Nazi politicians. So when Brecht thought about the problem, he created a puppet. When Heiner Müller wanted to have at a specific point show Hitler, he created a dreamlike atmosphere where the appearance of Hitler was some kind of hyper-realistic or grotesque appearance. And I think this also plays to the question, or to the aesthetic part of the question, and that is that obviously aesthetics is not just a question of choice and taste, but it also binds itself to a specific kind of ethical attitude. What is possible or what is appropriate to represent in what formalistic kind of language? I'm sorry, you don't want to say anything?